This recording of Stephen Levine was made on June 10, 1980, during a 3-day seminar held at Humboldt State University in Arcata, California.
This is from Krishnamurti. He says, now take death, which is an immense problem for most people. You know death. There it is walking every day by your side. But is it possible to meet death so completely that you do not make a problem of it at all? In order to meet death in such a way, all belief, all hope, all fear about it must come to an end. Otherwise you are meeting this extraordinary thing with a conclusion, with an image, with a premeditated anxiety, and therefore you are meeting it within time. Time is the interval between the observer, you, and the observed, the world as you know it. That is, the observer, you, is afraid to meet this thing called death. You don't know what it means. You have all kinds of hope and theories about it. You believe in reincarnation or resurrection, or in something called the soul, the Atman, a spiritual entity which is timeless and which you call by many different names. But have you found out for yourself whether there is a soul? Or is it just an idea that has been handed down to you? Is there something permanent, continuous, which is beyond thought? But if thought can think about it, it is impermanent, because everything is impermanent within the field of thought. There is nothing permanent within that flow. To discover that nothing is permanent is of tremendous importance, for only then is the mind free. Then you can look, and in that looking there is great joy. You cannot be frightened of the unknown because you do not know what the unknown is, and so there is nothing to be frightened of. Death is a word, and it is the word, the image, that creates fear. So can you look at death without the image of death? As long as the image exists from which springs thought, thought must always create fear. Then you either rationalize your fear of death and build a resistance against the inevitable, or you invent innumerable beliefs to protect you from the fear of death. Hence there is a gap between you and the thing of which you are afraid. In this time-space interval, there must be conflict, which is fear, anxiety, and self-pity. Thought, which breeds the fear of death, says, let's postpone it, let's avoid it, let's keep it as far away as possible, let's not think about it. But you are thinking about it. When you say, I won't think about it, you have already thought out how to avoid it. You are frightened of death because you have postponed it. We have come together to stop postponing death, which means to stop postponing life. Most people, and very much of most of our lives, is spent in a very intense denial of the truth of our whole being. One of the clearest manifestations of that denial of being is our denial of death. Most people who speak of conscious dying, and we're all interested in trying to understand how to make that transition easier for others and for ourselves, but when you really start seeing who is speaking about conscious death, you see that this being that is sitting here, this being sitting in your chair, has vast areas that it is postponing, that it is denying, vast areas of life. And that really the study, the participation, the investigation of conscious dying is an investigation of life, of an investigation of just this much, this instant right now, just this that we are receiving, that we call our experience now. We speak of dying, and yet there are large aspects of ourselves that are still in the womb. It's almost as though we're half out of the womb, that we've really never touched ground, because there are such touchy areas in ourselves that we wish not to bring out into the light. There is so much fear, so much guilt, so much anger, so much confusion, so much self-pity, so much rationalization for that which needs no rationalization. This constant elimination from the mind of certain states of mind that when they arise we say, no, that can't be me. That fear can't be me. That anger can't be me. That self-hatred can't be me. That guilt can't be me. It's almost as though we're this puzzle that was not originally a puzzle, that was just one picture of things as they are in this moment, in this being, that got fractured like a mirror that a great boulder has dropped on and shattered it into all these different pieces and broken it from one single thing into this fractured reality, this puzzle. And then as we look at this fractured reality, we say, oh, but there's my lust. Now, I don't want anybody to know about my lust. That's not such a good thing. I'm not supposed to have that. Take that piece out. Oh, and there's my self-pity. I'm not supposed to feel sorry for myself. Of course, if they knew what my life has been like. That piece goes out. And you look at your greed. You look at your self-interest. You notice your sexual fantasies and your fantasies of power and your fantasies of competition and your confusion, and you start picking these pieces out because these are unacceptable parts of yourself to you. So that you start taking out so much that when you look down at this fractured mirror, this fractured puzzle, it reflects very little of you, and that's just what you want. Because we think we have something to lose. And the reinforcement of that feeling that there's something to protect isolates us so incredibly from life and from each other. Leaves us such a fractured reality through which we try to express this naturalness of being that life is usually quite confusing. And we wonder, how do I get out of this womb? How do I start coming into a place within me where there's room in my heart for me and for other beings? How, when these qualities arise, when this anger arises, when this fear arises, when this doubt arises, when these things that I wish not to be me arise, I notice that whenever any one of these things arise, as I'm taking it out of the puzzle, my heart closes. How can I keep my heart open when it isn't pleasant what I'm experiencing? When I am seeing my own self-interest, when I am seeing my fear, when I am seeing guilt, when I am seeing self-doubt, when my predominant state of mind is confusion, can I still keep my heart open? Or do I have to be somewhere else? The very nature of having to be somewhere else is hell. Resistance to what is hell. And we live a considerable percent of our time in hell. Anger arises in the mind. Very confusing. We think, well, gee, if I'm a spiritual person, I shouldn't have any anger. I must not be a spiritual person. I've got to not show this anger. I've got to get rid of this anger. And there's confusion because anger is the truth. Now, if you try to get rid of that anger, if you try to pretend it's not there, you've eluded another opportunity for liberation, for freedom. Because we don't know what anger is, and we don't know what fear is, and we don't know what doubt is, because whenever they arise, instead of being the truth, they become an emergency to us, and we rush to go in the other direction. We try to escape the truth. We are constantly trying to escape the truth because we don't want to be vulnerable to the truth. We want to capture the truth and turn it into ourselves so that we can use it to control the world. And it's that very attempt at control that is the root of our greatest suffering. That holding on to things being a certain way. But things aren't a certain way. Things are as they are. And they're this way one moment, and they're that way another moment. And sometimes the truth is that there's anger in your mind, that there's fear in your mind, that there's greed in your mind, that there's lust in your mind, that there's ignorance in your mind. It's okay. If it isn't okay, there you are, hanging out of the womb, signaling to somebody else hanging out of the room, but pretending that both of your feet are touching the ground, and neither cops to the other one's groundlessness, to the other one's partiality, because it's not polite. In the same way it's not polite to be angry, it's not polite to be frightened. It's not. Anger is a very good one to examine, because anger is, for most people, such an unacceptable situation on the one hand, and such a compulsive way of behaving in the other. When you really start investigating anger, though, when anger becomes the meditation, rather than getting out of that, oh, if I'm a spiritual person, I won't be angry anymore. Well, I know a lot of very high spiritual people, and I don't know anyone who's without anger. To be without anger means you have no desires. No desires, no model of how things can be, so there's no frustration. No frustration, no anger. If your mind doesn't cling at anything being any way at all, then there's no anger. Your models, your ideas of who you are and how the world is supposed to be. But what those models do is they start creating bars in a cage that we find ourselves living in. Because this model means I can't go any farther than this idea. Outside of this idea, I'm confused and upset, and I don't know who I am. Because I think who I am is my ideas and my models. Because I think I am my mind. So the mind stuff is who I imagine myself to be. So when the mind stuff gets confronted with a reality that's unacceptable, internal or external, we start to get confused, we start to panic, we start to climb back in the womb. Again and again, I'm with people who die, who are still partially in the womb. And I see how their death is a tragedy and a fright to them, and is very confusing, because they're still relating to death as outside of themselves. Just like they related to their anger and their fear and their difficulty in relating to other human beings, as though it were outside of themselves, as though they were a victim of their feelings, of their thoughts, rather than the space within which all these thoughts are happening. A non-judging, exquisitely merciful space that really doesn't care what the object of mind is, because it is the essence of mind. It is just space. It doesn't call itself Stephen or Fred or Andrea or Charlie. It just is. It is a space of isness itself. It is the awareness that we normally call I. But we have lost our spaciousness to such a degree that we believe we're everything that arises in the mind. So when anger arises, instead of keeping that natural spaciousness of being, which you can call awareness, some people might, there's many names for that naturalness, for that spaciousness. It can be called awareness, it can be called God, it can be called the Tao, the natural flow. It's what is. It is the isness of being. It is when Moses comes to the burning tree says, I'm God. And he says, far out, who's God? And the burning bush says, God is, I am that I am. God is being. I am that I am. And it's interesting because when we say I am, when everybody says I am, the I that you're amming at that moment is all the same I. When you say I am this quality of mind, or I am this body, or I am this profession, or I am this, or I am that, then the truth is fractured, just like that rock hitting the mirror. Then the one is shattered into the 10,000. But when you just say I am, that's the truth. When you say I am this or I am that, it can be anything. You can say I am a student, but more like if you say I am happy or I am sad or I am a carpenter or whatever you say I am this, you notice that there's a slight feeling of not quite telling the truth. Because nothing that is I am this can be the whole truth. In fact, everybody walks around feeling like an imposter. And it's true not that you're pretending to be someone else, although that's a part of how we try to find our ground. When you say I am this, it's never quite the truth. It's a part of the truth. But when you simply say I am, that's the truth. That's just being. That's the common underlying reality that we all share. That's the one. But we're constantly being I am this, which means I am not that. I am not that fear, I am not that guilt, I'm not that anger. But there's anger in the mind, and there's fear in the mind, and there's guilt in the mind, and there's this, as Zorba the Greek says, there's the whole catastrophe. Now, how do you make that catastrophe not a catastrophe? How do you change it from a tragedy into seeing the incredible underlying grace of what our human experience is? How, when anger comes up, instead of it closing the heart, when you really start investigating anger, you see one of the first things you notice is how incredibly isolating it is. And that when you're in anger, you are in such pain. I mean, there is hardly, you can't, who would you ever inflict that pain on? We would treat ourselves in ways we'd never treat another human being. But it's okay to do it to us, because we've lost the essence of who we really are. We've forgotten we're God. We've forgotten we're the truth. And that forgetfulness is so painful that really, when you talk about grief, that's the grief you're talking about. The real loss is the loss of our touch with who we really are. We've suppressed so much. There is so many parts of ourselves that we've found unacceptable, that frighten us, that confuse us, that when these qualities come up, we push them down. And we start to tend to think that that's who we really are. We think, well, if people knew who I really was. And our really is actually just the natural flow, parts of which so frightened us, because they so conflicted with our model of who we were, because they were outside of our cage, outside the bars on our cage, that we've pushed them down. And then we think, well, who I really am is, I'm really frightened, I'm really lonely, I'm really greedy, I'm really needy. That's not who we are. As long as we think that's who we are, that's who we are. Because as long as you think that that's who you are, when that quality of mind arises, you push it down, and that's as deep as you can go. Anger comes up. Oh, I'm not that angry. I mustn't be that angry. You push it down, and that's as deep as your awareness, who you are, your experience, will go. And that's all you experience of yourself, is what's in awareness and what you push down out of awareness, which means that you almost exactly the opposite of cultivating clarity. You are trying to keep awareness from going deeper, because deeper is where is the industrial dump. That's where your waste is. You think it's waste because you don't see how anger or fear or doubt can take you to God, can take you to the truth, can give you for yourself your own understanding of who you are. Not what I say you are, or Krishnamurti says you are, or Ram Dass says you are, or Jesus says you are. Who you are, because you are the truth. And you don't need anyone outside of yourself. In fact, no one outside of yourself can take you to the truth. Buddha left a roadmap. Jesus left a roadmap. Krishna left a roadmap. Rand McNally left a roadmap. But you still have to drive it for yourself. You still have to walk it for yourself. No one else can do your work for you. And that's why you start seeing that life is actually this incredible opportunity each moment to work on yourself. So you start seeing what closes me. There was a fellow we'll talk about off and on during the next days, a Thailandic meditation master by the name of Ajahn Chah, who's an amazingly clear fellow. In the beginning of his practice, brought up in Thailand, early in his teens he decided to take robes because he saw that his priority was to try more than anything else to understand what sits here. To understand just this much. What is the truth of this moment? Because in this moment is it all. What's being suppressed? Where is awareness? Why is this awareness that we are usually so shallow? And he was practicing for a few years, and he heard of another meditation master in the northeastern part of Thailand who was reputed to have no anger. No anger is a big thing when you think about what that means. It means a mind that does not cling anywhere. And it means the person has tuned in to who they've always been, and they have become their original nature to such an extent that they see that no object in mind, even anger, is who they are, and they don't identify with anything that comes up in the mind as being separate from the truth. They are just the truth. Which sounds flashier than it is, because it's your underlying nature and can be tuned into relatively easily. It's just remembering to let go of what blocks that truth. So here's this meditation master who's got no anger, and he says, far out, this is somebody I really have to be around. He gives up his robes in the sect that he's in and starts again as a novice in this other sect. He's not interested in the hierarchy game. He really wants to find out what the truth is. He spends about a year and a half with this meditation master. The fellow never seems angry. Very impressive. One day he's in an L-shaped kitchen. Everybody's waiting for the guy to blow it. Blow it, blow it. So I won't be so bad. He's in an L-shaped kitchen, and he sees the master over there, and the master's cutting up some food, and there's some vegetables, and there's some meat. And a dog comes into the room and puts his paws up on the counter and grabs the meat. And the meditation master looks either way and kicks the dog. And Ajahn Chah got the teaching and could go on then. But imagine how painful it is for that fellow to be someone who doesn't have anger when there is actually anger in the mind at times. Imagine the incredible suffering, the incredible mercilessness to himself to pretend, for any reason at all, that what is present in the mind isn't present in the mind. And yet here we are. All of us doing it, all of us partially born, all of us denying parts of ourselves. All of us, imagine if for the next 24 hours your mind was amplified so that everyone within 100 feet could hear everything you're thinking. You laugh because those are the parts of yourself that you're hiding. That's the parts of yourself that you think are unacceptable. When you walk by that blonde and you think about her derriere, you go, oh my God, if she could hear that. And she walks by you and thinks about something, and the game keeps going on, but we keep all playing. You know, I'm not greedy, I'm not jealous, I'm not competitive, I'm not angry. Oh boy, am I confused. But we are all those things. And to be whole means to start to make space in your heart, to start to make room in your heart for what the truth is, for what's coming up. We've suppressed so much of this stuff that it is very common and is a very popular philosophical tenet that man is by nature evil, because look at all that anger in there, and look at all that fear in there, and look at all that aggression in there. Yup, it's all there. And that is like saying that the earth is solid, when indeed it has a molten core that is always changing. We have stuffed this stuff down, and that's as deep as we can go. And when we start letting it come up into awareness, when the priority starts to be, what is the truth? Who am I? What's going on? What dies? Who dies? What is this that dies? Am I this body? Am I this mind? Am I these states of mind? Why is it when I am with people who are dying, who start to let go of those models of themselves as being a holy person or a saint or an asshole, whichever end of the spectrum your mind plays on you? When you stop letting go of your social identity, your sexual identity, your economic identity, your intellectual identity, all these things that are who you think you are and who you attempt to project into the world, your self-image, your imagined self. Why is it when people start letting go of that, I hear them again and again say, I've never been so alive. I only have 2 months to live, maybe, and I've never been so alive in my whole life because I'm not in my cage anymore. Because all these models of how I've seen the world have actually enslaved me into, I've sort of painted myself into a corner. I've given less and less of myself room to be alive. I've denied more and more parts of myself so as to fit a self-image in my own mind and in other people's eyes. And it has been so painful that now is the happiest time of my life, even though I'm dying. Because these models are such bondage. But when you start letting the stuff come up, fear comes into awareness and you give it space. Instead of identifying with it, instead of losing all your space, instead of the I am being just space, it becomes I am angry. The space is instantly lost, and the I am is the anger then, instead of that exquisite open spaciousness of being that we all share. and that when we're quiet we can tune right into. And then what happens, the anger starts coming up, and the fear comes up, and the self-doubt comes up, and they become objects of investigation. Instead of being enemies, they become something that reminds you how painful it is when your heart closes. How isolating the anger is. The anger is like picking up a burning ember with the intention of throwing it at someone, all the time searing your flesh profoundly. How, when you look at anger, can you not have compassion for the person who's experiencing that, even though it happens to be you? You look at how isolating, how painful, how when I'm angry at you, there's no love transmitted. There's nothing of value transmitted between us because we don't even cop to the truth that we're angry and that we're confused. And for those times when you have been angry at someone, all of a sudden in the middle of it, caught it and shared it, the love that is transmitted, the trust, the honesty, the I don't know, but here's the anger, isn't this extraordinary? And we can use this too as a means of uncovering the truth. Then it becomes workable, because most of our lives are not workable. We live that life of quiet desperation, of denial. But then when I start letting it come up, my awareness is no longer limited to just pushing that stuff down. And anger comes up and my awareness can go deeper. It can go beyond the dump, beyond the repressed, suppressed area, and can start going into deeper and deeper levels of being, because you're not suppressing anything. Suppression cuts you off. You cannot go deeper than the suppressed stuff, because that you are literally attempting to keep awareness away from that instead of letting awareness penetrate. So the very act of suppression is an act of keeping yourself shallow. So you start suppressing nothing, and you start letting all of this come up, and they become objects to see. They become mirrors of awareness. So that anger comes up, and you're not angry, you're investigating anger. Very different. A moment of anger, when you're identifying with it, when you've lost your space and you are it, is a moment of incredible self-pain. And it has the qualities of wanting to do injury to its object and all this stuff that you then call yourself names for, and you get confused. Or anger can come up and it can float in space, and instead of being a moment of anger, it's a moment of awareness. And compassion starts, because you start seeing the qualities that have so often closed the heart, have so often made life difficult. We see how we put away so much as a means of trying to be happy, and yet somehow we're not happy. There may be moments of satisfaction, but they don't stay. We keep even involving ourselves in old patterns, thinking that somehow they're going to bear fruit, although they seem never to have. That we keep suppressing the same stuff, but it still seems to be there. Not recognizing that our suppression is activating those qualities. That it's just negative attachment, that that's who you think you are. You think you're your fear, so you put it down. You think you're your anger, so you put it down. Instead of letting it be seen as a natural part of this conditioning that is unfolding, that we're processing. There's a story about Nasruddin, who is a Sufi comic teaching figure, a wise man in Sufi tradition, who comes back from the marketplace with this huge basket of hot chili peppers. And he's sitting in his room and he's eating one chili pepper after another, and obviously they're incredibly hot. And his eyes are running, and his lips are chapped and split, and his tongue is swollen, and there's saliva in the corner of his mouth. And one of his friends comes in and says, "Baba, how can you eat those incredibly hot chili peppers, one after the other?" He said, "Well, I got them in the market, and they were such a bargain I couldn't pass them up." And he says, "I understand, but Baba, how can you do that to yourself? How can you eat one hot pepper after another?" He says, "Oh, I keep thinking I'll find a sweet one." And that's how we live our lives. We keep thinking we'll find a sweet one. That's why in those stages of dying that you hear about, where there's the denial and the anger and the bargaining and the depression, Depression is a very interesting one because most people are so frightened to be around someone who is in depression because it's such a trigger and a mirror for their own confusion. And yet I see that depression has an incredibly creative quality in it. Because depression means you've come to the end of the road where you think you're going to find a sweet one. It's not working. I can't suppress it anymore. I can pretend I'm not angry. I can pretend I don't have fear. I can pretend I don't have lust. I can pretend all these things, but they're still there. And my life is, the bars on the cage get fatter and fatter, and the space in which I have to live gets smaller and smaller. Because there's so much of me I deny, so many ideas through which I see the world that I can hardly touch the truth. And I'm just backed into this dark corner, and it's incredibly painful. And out of that depression of, what do I do now, may come the answer. Because maybe for once you don't know. At last you don't know. You've known so damned much that the space in which the truth might arise spontaneously has been full, and there's been no room for the truth. There's been no vulnerability to the truth. Because the essence of the teaching is, can you keep your heart open in hell? When you're closing down, when you're angry, can you still have love for yourself? When you're frightened, can you still have an open space within which you're allowed to be frightened? Or is it all so suppressed? Is it all so pushed down? Are all the patterns so activated that everything is so busy that there's no space for the truth? We know so much. We are all so together. We are all together, two together. And there is such pain in our heart because of it. Not now. Not knowing the room for the truth to arise. It's really like getting out of our own way. In the same way that a healer, when a healer works, what he essentially does is he gets out of his own way and lets the process, the extraordinary energy of the universe, manifest through him. He's not doing anything. As a matter of fact, for a moment, he stopped doing, so that the process that he is becomes a conduit for the truth, for the energy of the universe. In that same way, that mind that isn't so caught in knowing, the mind that doesn't know, don't know, that's the mind that really has room to understand. Don't know. Anger's in the mind? Don't know. That's okay. Okay anger, okay fear, okay doubt, okay jealousy, okay envy. If you say it's not okay, it closes your heart. Is it okay to close your heart? It's okay. It's awful painful though. There's no should in this. It's just, at what point does the priority change where you just can't stand your heart being closed anymore? Well, it's just too damn painful. Well, you've had enough. Well, you're ready to come out of the womb and live a life that's right here with yourself, with this room in your heart and in your mind for whatever the truth might be at that moment. Most people live their lives like it was an emergency. It's not an emergency. It's okay. A friend of mine said she was going to write Elizabeth Kubler Ross, who I taught with for a couple of years, said she was going to write a book, and she was going to entitle it, "I'm Not Okay, and You're Not Okay, and That's Okay." The only reason you can recognize the truth when you hear it is because the truth is who you are, and all these words can do is act as a mirror for your being. And there's some things that are said that are meaningful and useful, and the rest might not be at all meaningful. In fact, it might even be confusing. It might even block your openness. Don't try to don't grasp at anything, even the truth. You are the truth. All you have to do is give it the space to be. It is the grasping that closes you off. Even grasping at the truth. Grasping at enlightenment. I think it was Rajneesh wrote a book called Nirvana, the Final Nightmare. Because once you start seeing how enslaved you are, then you get so enslaved to freedom. People are so attached to being non-attached that that's how they're in the womb. It doesn't matter what you're attached to. There's no object of attachment. God or heroin, same object of attachment. The mind closes around it. When the mind is closed, there's no room for the truth. We were doing a 5-day retreat at Lama Foundation. These are meditation-oriented retreats where we all stay together for 5 days, and there's some sitting and a lot of sharing. And there was a couple at the retreat from Ashland, Oregon, whose 11-year-old daughter was abducted, tortured, and murdered a couple of months ago. Her and her best girlfriend. You could see what happened to those beings' hearts by that experience. That experience was so outside of any model of acceptability possible in their mind. I mean, it's every mother's worst nightmare. That it blew them out of their cage, because there was no way they could hold on any longer. There was no way they could keep their heart closed. There was no way they could control the universe. There was no way they could make it go away. There was no way that anything else but the truth could be seen by their minds and their hearts. And their pain was so extraordinary that they simply couldn't hold it anymore, and they were blown past that which they'd suppressed, that which the models of the universe. And they were just, their heart was torn open. And I see again and again in people in deep grief that grief has a quality in it where a person is blown past their models of who they are. A person in real grief, in deep grief, doesn't care what they eat, isn't interested in sex, doesn't care what they look like to other people, doesn't care what their mind appears like, is not interested in economics or fashions. Indeed, in a real sense, a person whose mind is in grief has gone so out of the superficial, out of the cage, that they are often have deeper access to themselves than at any other time in a lifetime, unless they happen to be doing really assiduous spiritual work, where they're really working hard at letting go and going deeper. Because grief forces you so deep. It forces you into a kind of reservoir of loss, where all the things that had meaning before have no meaning now. It often forces people into areas that have been so suppressed, there has been so much pushed down. The loss of so much of what you have loved has occurred. Most of your friends, since the time you began friends, have changed, have gone. Most relationships have ended. Much that you hoped would be very sunny and bright has become dark and frightening. The cage has gotten smaller and smaller. You've lost so much trust in yourself. You have seen so much that you love die, so much that you love change, that there is a place within where there is a very profound grief, a grief of loss of trust in ourselves, a grief in loss in trust that we can make anything solid, because nothing can be held. And the harder you hold it, because everything is within the nature of change, because everything is impermanent, the harder you hold it, the deeper the rope burns, the more profound the searing of that grief. A woman we know was on the coast, the shore in Oregon, with her child, a couple of children. And they were on vacation, her husband and a couple of children, and I believe a neighbor was there with their children. And her 6-year-old and an older child that I think was 10, and the neighbor's children were bobbing on a log just offshore. And the 6-year-old child, a wave came and knocked all the kids off the log, and they were laughing and carrying on and scrambling to get back on the log, and apparently a second wave that was an oddly strong took the 6-year-old out. Everybody ran out. There was no way they could save the 6-year-old. The 6-year-old was dragged out to sea. A couple of days later, there's a call from the coroner's office would you come down and identify what we believe are the remains of your daughter? And she comes down, and they say, well, before you go into the viewing room, we want you to understand something. The remains, this child has been partially eaten by sharks. It isn't what caused the death, but what you're going to see is a badly mangled body. And the woman walked in, and she saw this child laying there that had been the most important thing to her in the world. And there was no way she could close her heart to that truth. There was no way she could deny or elude the reality that was there in front of her. And it tore her heart open and burst her mind in such a way that she had an experience of the vastness of her being, unparalleled in her lifetime. She just went beyond all the places she had been able to hold. She couldn't hold it any longer. There was no way she could resist it. There was no way she could elude the truth. And it threw her out of her prison, out of her locked-inness, her models. And her experience was the beginning. It was like an initiation. It was the beginning of a real deepening in her life. I see her almost not at all. Every once in a while I'll get a message, and it sounds like she's doing incredibly well. But it took something so powerful to break her out, to break us all out. Grief has a quality of healing in it that can be so deep, because a person is existing at a level, a depth of emotion that is usually below the level of awareness. Motivations come from it, but you don't know where the motivations are coming from. You just find yourself in action. It's sort of like a tree. The leaves of the tree and the flowers of the tree you're familiar with. And you see how the leaves come into being, and you see how they are, but you don't see where the nutrients, where the materials that feed that reality come from, because you're always above ground level in the conscious mind, if you will. And there's this tree of personality and doing and events. But what grief does, it forces you below ground level. It forces you into a place that is so painful you would never go voluntarily. So much has been pushed down there. And in that space, it's like if you walked into a cave that had been dark for 10 millennia. A single match would dispel that darkness. Darkness is just the absence of light.